Well, it's the last seminar of the season, and I get to do the introduction today. And I'm really pleased to introduce to you, many of you have already met her, but I'm pleased to introduce to those of you who have not met her, Dr. Sabrina Higgins. Sabrina has an undergraduate degree from the University of Ottawa. She went to UBC, did a master's in Near Eastern Studies, and then on back to the University of Ottawa for her PhD. She was appointed in September, 1st of September, as a faculty member in Hellenic Studies, and through astute negotiations with the director of Hellenic Studies over here, we've managed to acquire Sabrina as a quarter-time appointment in the Department of Archaeology, where she's going to alternatively teach different years courses in ancient Greece and the art and archaeology of ancient Rome, which, if you're an undergraduate student, lots of space in these courses coming up in the spring semester, so please give them serious consideration. Sabrina also will be helping us to develop a minor in classical archaeology within the department, and it will be a collaborative kind of thing with Hellenic Studies, and there'll be a lot of sort of Hellenic Studies courses involved in this as well. And if Dr. Joe Midas gets his way, they'll all be online as well. We'll have to wait and see. So I'm going to simply turn this over to Sabrina, and she's going to speak to the title, which is up here, and there are words in there I don't even want to begin.
That's what you get when you work in a Slavic country. So first of all, thank you guys so much for coming. It's great to see a full room here. I'm really excited to give you a preview of sort of what I teach on, and a preview of the excavation that I've been working on off and on since 2010. Which is at a site in the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia called Golemo Gradiste in the village of Konjuh. So the site of Golemo Gradiste, which, you know, we're very creative, it literally means big hill, is situated just outside the village of Konjuh, which is about 40 kilometers east of Skopje, which is the capital of Macedonia. And in late antiquity, this was a fortified, but still anonymous city. You know, it's every archaeologist's dream to find a big, you know, inscription that says "you are here." Basically, we're yet to find that. Still anonymous city that probably stood in the southeast corner of the Roman province of Dardania, so just right up here. And the ancient capital was Skopje, same as the modern capital, Skopje. Now, the Kriva River is a river that provides a sort of natural defense for our site on three sides. So you've got this massive hill, and then the Kriva River on three sides. And it was really kind of ideally situated in a really prosperous mining district, and along a major east-west road. And this road connected Skopje, or ancient Skopje, with Serdica, or modern Sofia, in Bulgaria. So Thrace. So you can see here, there'd be a major road that connected both of our sites. Now, it gets its name, right, Big Hill, from this Acropolis here. So we've got a really long east-west running Acropolis, or sort of large hilltop, that rises about 100 meters above the level of the Kriva, which you can kind of see along the outskirts here. So it really does provide a natural fortification system, of course, topped with actual fortifications as well. So you've got this broad, kind of gently sloping terrace that slopes down to the north, and you've got a settlement that we are finding down here, which is where we're currently working, but also a settlement on top of the Acropolis. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about this period that is only really sort of starting to come into its own, and that's late antiquity, right? This period between, I mean, I don't want to get into the debate about late antiquity when it starts, but generally, let's say, you know, the time that we're concerned with is in the 5th and 6th and 7th centuries AD. So a time when Christianity is really prospering in the East. And while the site might be along a major east-west, or a major road running, all the way to Sofia, to Serdica, this site is really in the middle of nowhere. Like, absolutely in the middle of nowhere. Up until last year, we didn't have a road that went to our site. So, you turn on the four wheels, the four-wheel drive and go across mountains, and boulders sometimes fall just in front of your car, and, it's a process. And this would have been fairly similar. It's along this road, but really kind of in the middle of nowhere. But that being said, it was a surprisingly prosperous settlement. So you've got not only our major excavations, which are occurring down here at the Basilica, but you have 3 other churches in this small, sort of rural settlement. So, and I just want to briefly go through these and briefly kind of show you some pictures of each of these here. So we've got the first one here, which is our Rotunda Church. This one is really uniquely constructed. You can see kind of the circular pattern here, your apse, right, the sort of at the east that protrudes outwards. This is sort of where you would have turned towards the altar where veneration would have occurred. And that's what it looks like today. So not much left, unfortunately, but this would have been one of the major sort of churches outside of the fortification walls of the city. Another one is the Kisla Cemetery Church. And for us, we live right next to it when we're on site. And it's basically a cemetery. So we've got graves all the way around our church, and we had a vaulted tomb, which unfortunately was robbed out, but seems to have held the remains of someone, whether it was an important priest at the site, whether it was relics for a saint, or perhaps the saint of that church, or to whom it was dedicated. We don't know, but it seems to be very important for this settlement because most of the burials at our site are located around this. So, of course, outside of the fortification walls, because you don't bury your dead inside the city, right? You don't want to contaminate your water sources. So here, outside of the city fortification walls. Now, in the year 2000, rather, excavations began at the site. So we've been here, I was still in high school, they have been there since the year 2000, and excavating every year since then. So we've been in the area for 16 years. And they excavated the Acropolis first. So what we're seeing on the Acropolis is a 6th century AD settlement that coincides with actually a period of sort of rebirth at Golemo Gradiste. And by rebirth, I mean there was an original settlement in the 5th century, and then something happened. Someone came in the 6th century, we think a really sort of energetic bishop, right? A sort of high-level priest who reinvigorated the site. But it's also corresponding with a period of sort of unsettlement in the area. So barbarian invasions, tensions between groups outside of the empire and those in Constantinople, modern Istanbul. So we think this was built as a refuge on top of the hill. So you've got fortification walls, you've got buildings actually constructed into the rocky outcrop. Now, I say Acropolis, and it's not flat up there. There are rocks everywhere. And so they're using the space they have to construct something that would be safe. And you even get sort of cave dwellings, so people coming in, constructing benches inside these caves as a manner of protection. Now, we worked up in this area until about 2005, at which point they had exhausted really what they could study at the top and decided to move down. And this is where we've been working ever since. So since 2005, we've been on the lower terrace. Now, at first, they worked over in sort of this area here. So they're finding some of the fortification walls, and then this area right here is some of the lower town. Now, this area is about 11 hectares. We've excavated less than maybe 2 at this point. And barely any of the settlement. So from 2005 to 2008, they were excavating the settlement and the fortification walls, and then we haven't touched the settlement since, in fact. So the rest of our excavation seasons for now actually will be looking towards these settlements, what we can see, what we can tell about the city, how it was arranged around the basilica, because we've almost completely explored the basilica right now. So in 2008, however, we happened to come across the apse of our basilica. So we knew there was a church down there. They'd seen some of the churches outside of the fortification walls, and then we happened to come across it. Now, this might look very sort of innocuous, but when you're expecting a church and all of a sudden you see, an apse, right, this sort of arched segment of rock appearing. I mean, this is any late antique Christian archaeologist's dream, right? To find the apse of a basilica and know that you've actually stumbled upon it. And they did. In all honesty, anyone who's actually been on a field school or who works, in archaeology, we should have known that this is where it would have been, and it shouldn't have taken 5 years to find it. Largely because there were robber pits everywhere in this area. The locals obviously knew that this is where the basilica was. No one said anything. But people had been illegally digging in this area for generations. And we had piles of rocks, trenches that have been slightly overgrown. And so really we should have known that this is where, the nice things were, because the locals were obviously robbing it out. But despite the pillaging, despite people constantly coming into the site and robbing it of materials, it's still in relatively good condition. So this is a picture of where we're working as of the end of the season of 2016. So you can see here by now, right, this is what we found in 2008, and in the last 8 years, this is what we've excavated. So not only do we have a large basilica complex, so large church, and you've got all of these auxiliary rooms all the way around it, you also have a residential complex immediately to the north. Now this residential complex is so large, it was uncovered in 2009. We still haven't found the entrance. Yeah, so but we bet every year on when we're going to find it. I keep losing. But what's really interesting about this residential complex is if you look at the way the room is laid out, there's hardly any 90-degree angles, right? It's really roughly constructed in the interior. But the outside, you've got really kind of this rectangular shape that exists. But there's been so many modifications to the inside, and that the rooms have changed hands a lot over the period of time, or at least remodeled. So we've got, this seems to be our corridor here. You can see the outline of columns flanking a central corridor. Over here, you've got food preparation and storage. But then it was reused later. So you see these really well-built walls here, and then ones that appear almost lighter in color and sort of off-center. And these are the ones that were built later to divide up the space. Because at some point, when our church went out of use, people came back and started living in the spaces, right? Sort of squatting, if you will, and redividing the space. And we actually came across something really interesting last year where in this room here, someone had dug up 2 massive holes, pits that sort of were 2 meters wide, or in diameter rather, and about 5 meters deep. And partway through, we found a body that had kind of been just dumped in there. And so it was used as sort of burial / squatter occupation, and it was constantly changing shape. But I want to really focus today on the basilica, because the basilica is incredibly unique. And I feel really fortunate that I get to work on a site like this where it has features that, one, I've never seen elsewhere in any Christian building that I've ever worked or studied. And 2, it's just massive. Stop. It's still growing. And for a small settlement in the middle of nowhere. This is not what you would expect. So we're going to focus on some of the findings from the excavations over the last few years, but particularly this past summer. So the church itself, as you can see, is located in the middle of our northern terrace. And it's what we call a three-aisled basilica. And what that means is that you've got a central nave here and then two side aisles on either side. They're typically smaller. Now, the length of the basilica, just to give you an idea, is about 33 meters, and it's about 15 meters wide. So it's massive. But it kind of narrows at the end. So the west end here is about a meter narrower than the east. So it's not perfectly laid out. Now, to enter the basilica, you have to go through the narthex, which is this area right in front of the basilica proper. And so yeah, you can see it here. So you enter through the narthex, and then there are other rooms, unfortunately not included on this plan. But what's really sort of fascinating about our site is that because we're working on a terrace, everything is at different levels. So not only are we working on, the basilica, which is seemingly, level, but every room, as you move south from the Acropolis down on the plain, is a different height. So the northern residence, the residential complex, is nearly 3 meters lower than the church itself. So we're constantly dealing with different levels and also trying to figure out how this is structured. And a lot of that's done through terrace walls. So building terrace walls to kind of keep back soil that would roll down from the Acropolis. So this is a very prominent feature that we're seeing within our site. And actually, this part here, in between here, seems to be a street. And initially, this is actually to this day, this is the only entry point we've found into the basilica. So strange, because you're coming at it from the side. So you've got a street here leading into a door somewhere in here. And we've excavated even more than that, and I still haven't found the primary entrance for the basilica. So there's more to be done, I guess, in that respect. Now, if we're going to talk about the narthex a little bit, sort of how this basilica was entered, one thing I want everyone to sort of keep in mind as we're going through this talk is how strangely placed things are and how asymmetrical this entire plan is. So while we seem to have someone who's really ambitious building our church, really no design, no aesthetic incorporated into all of this. So the doors are completely off-center, your entryways into the aisles, although you've got sort of a main entrance here. But the narthex, or the entryways, also providing access to a multitude of other rooms associated with our church. So you've got steps, for instance. Let me just get myself, yeah. So you've got steps coming from some of these annex rooms on the side. Again, you can see the sort of terracing that's done even within the church. And then you have strange, unidentifiable features that are found throughout. So you've got this platform over here in the corner, stairs leading up to the annex room this way, and stairs and doorways also leading out further towards where we expect to one day find our entrance. Now, while we have all of these rooms, there's hardly anything left in them to give us an idea of what they were used for. A lot of what we know about them comes from the post-basilical occupation. So our basilica goes out of use sometime in the 6th century, and most of what we're finding is squatter occupation. So they seem to have cleared all of the floors of most of the goods before the basilica went out of use, brought them with them probably up to the top of the Acropolis, but then came back and squatted after the basilica had suffered some damage. And so what we're seeing is layers and layers and layers of squatter occupation. So burnt pottery, a lot of charcoal, bone, broken glass is another big one. And this is what we're finding, but nothing on the floor levels, or very little on the floor levels. And one of these post uses of the basilica is found in room 2. So we're coming just off of our narthex here into room 2. where we actually found a cyst burial. Now, the cyst grave in the southwest corner contained a skeleton of an adult male. And he seems to have been crippled as the result of a broken leg. And in good sort of early Christian form, the only grave good found with him was a small bronze cross. Now, this is absolutely after the basilica had went out of use. It cuts into the level of the floor. Yeah, probably was somebody important living in the community after this church had gone out of use and was buried inside of this room. Now, just next to this room, so we've got our room with the burial right here. Now, right here, we've got another room, room 3. And this is another one of these interesting features that you would see in maybe a larger, really central basilica, a central church in a major town. And that is a separate area for what we call the catechumen, or those who are uninitiated. Now, this is sort of a bold claim, I guess, to say that this is where the catechumen would have been. But if you were an uninitiated Christian, you could not come into the main basilica at the same time in worship and partake in the service as those who had received baptism. So you would receive instruction. And you would come into this room, and there's benches all the way along the wall on both sides, and up here there's a bit of a platform. Right? It's separate from the church itself, and it provides a room for you to come and learn before you receive baptism. And it makes sense that the catechumen would be here because it's immediately attached to where we find the baptistry. Now, just sort of as a personal aside, my goal as an archaeologist, I mean, I work in early Christian archaeology, has always been to find a baptistry. And I took one summer off to finish my thesis. And for years and years and years, I've been saying, I want to find the baptistry in this church. If someone even thinks about coming across a baptistry, leave it alone, it's mine. I've claimed it. Let me have it. As I was finishing my thesis, the one season I wasn't there, they found the baptistry. Exactly where I had predicted it would be. And someone who has never come back to the site got to excavate it, and it broke my heart. And it's beautiful. It's absolutely stunning. And so you can see sort of the flow, right? Let's talk about flow, right? Christian architecture has order to it. And so you would come in, right, from the outside over here. You would come through all these rooms that are not sacred, you know, the same way that the church itself would be. Come into the catechumeneon, right, where you would receive your teachings, and then proceed here through to the baptistry, right, where you would be baptized. So there's this flow that exists. And then, once you were baptized, you can exit through this door and into the church. So the layout makes sense. But what's interesting about this particular piece is that there's a lot of elements to this baptistry that just don't quite add up. And this will make sense when we move to some of the other annex rooms in a second. But if you look at this, it's a really small room. It feels very cramped when you look at it here on the diagram. Baptistry is off-center. Granted, the door is off-center, but this wall was actually added later. So this seems to have been sort of a side chapel at first, and then this door added later, and the baptistry added later. And the baptistry itself isn't made of the same material. Everywhere throughout this church, we are finding one kind of white marble. Not really even marble, it's more sandstone-esque, but one type of stone. But here, the columns, some of the stones are made of different material. In fact, we have 3 different colors for columns at play here. But I'll come back to that, and I'll come back to why this is so strange and what makes our church, I guess, so unique. That begins with a discussion of the northern annex rooms. And this is primarily the area that I have been working since I started at the site. This is all me. So this room here, our northern annex room, connects the narthex, right, our entryway, with everything kind of leading up to the edge where you reach the northern residence. Now, here, you've got this really interesting structure at play. There were columns everywhere, massive 3-meter-long columns littered throughout this room. So it was obviously something important if you're going to have columns like that in a room. And as I was digging down, I came across this item here on the side. This is a baptismal font. So the other one is a pool, right? You walk in one side, you dip yourself, you fully immerse yourself, and you walk out the other end. But here, this marks a transition. This is the point at which you are no longer getting full baptism, or full immersion baptism, but baptism via sort of sprinkling, or child baptism, which doesn't happen right away. Christians didn't baptize their children at the outset of Christianity. You had to make a conscious choice to be a Christian. And this is around the period, the 5th, 6th century, we were starting to see this. An early example of it. And this was on top of this depression. So here, right, you have a nicely outlined area and a depression in the middle, but this was filled in, and on top of that, I found this font, this baptismal font. And this depression here looks oddly similar to a circular baptistry. What actually we think happened at the site, we'll need to excavate the rest. This still hasn't been excavated, but this is a full circle. I expect it to be. It seems as though this is where the original baptistry was. So I was excavating a baptistry, just a stolen one, covered over, and then they placed a font on top to mark an area, perhaps for changing function in baptism. So you have full immersion happening on one side, and later, when full immersion baptism is sort of ending, or becoming less popular at least, this area seems to have been used for infant baptism and or non-full immersion baptism. And it happens on a squatter level. So this font seems to have been laid out on one of the squatter levels. So the church is still in use. They're obviously not still using the full immersion baptistry and working instead with this other one. Now, just kind of get my slides in order. Okay, so I want to turn to a discussion now of some of the really unique features of the basilica proper. To give you a bit of an introduction, 3-aisled basilica. It's really long, it's really wide, but what makes it so special? So I want to talk about some of the really unique features specifically, and some things that I will poll the audience for afterwards because we still haven't figured out what they are. So if you have any ideas, feel free to interject. And so the one thing that was really unique about our whole basilica complex, not even just the basilica itself, was that there were no paved floors. So you had entirely mortar floors throughout the entire thing. The basilica proper, the baptistry, residential complex, no one has paved floors. It's all mortar. Except in 2016, we found a small area, which also is kind of mind-blowing. But none of the major structures had it. But there was a lot of changes happening over time. It seems as though, in the 5th century, they built something in this area. There's, materials underneath what we're working on. But when they reconstructed this larger basilica in the 6th century, they didn't like what they did, so they took it out and they changed it. And so you can see a little bit of that here. And I just wanted to give you an idea. This is what our floors look like. This is a nice bit of floor in our basilica. But it overlies the foundation here of this particular here, which would be where you put the columns. Now, this colonnade, let's say, the columns would have once stood directly on top of the mortar flooring, right? You've got this foundation for the columns, the mortar flooring over top, and then the colonnade. At some point, this was ripped out, and a wall was put in. And this is, again, changing things that are happening throughout the very short time that our basilica was in use. So originally, you could see through the colonnade. You would have columns here, right? So you could look into the nave. When you were in the nave, you could see into the aisles. But it doesn't want to change. Oh no. It froze. What? Okay. Oh, that's really terrible. Yeah, it's my computer. It's terrible. I'm just going to reboot it. I'm really sorry. I think when I don't touch it for, apparently 2 minutes, then it doesn't like me. But while that's rebooting, the colonnades were taken, not taken out, but they were modified. That you couldn't see the column bases anymore, and in between the two, oh no, that's a blue screen of death. I just tried to, okay, now I think it's going. But, so yeah, in between the two, you've got walls that were put up. These beautiful screen slabs that have various crosses on them, meter high. So you've got, just to give you sort of an idea of height here, you've got the bases which come to about here, then these screen slabs that are about a meter, and then on top of those, they have these moldings, these beautiful sort of like cornice moldings with decoration on them. And it would have completely blocked off your view. So if you were standing in the side aisle, going into, trying to see into the nave, you could no longer see anything. The columns, which once, had this open, airy kind of feeling, now everything was blocked off. And given the fact that, no longer can you see from the side aisles into the nave, it makes us think again about changing function. There seems to be a lot of remodeling happening. Now, we don't know why that is, but we can speculate that perhaps, one, there was a need to separate maybe the men from the women, not uncommon in this area of the world. So having men in the nave, women in the aisles, you could still hear, but you couldn't see them. Perhaps it was also for the catechumen, right, the uninitiated. So the catechumen being able to access the service, but not actually seeing the service, not actually seeing the sacred rites that are happening at that time. Or maybe the congregation just got smaller and there was no need for it, and they decided just to let the nave or the aisles go and keep everyone in the nave. All possibilities, but unfortunately, no more concrete answers than that right now. Okay. This is terrible. It's loading. I'm really sorry. This computer, I bought this computer in April too. You would think it would work. Okay, it's back. I just gotta find where I was. Okay, there. Full screen. Yay! So there you go. Look, beautiful crosses. So these are these massive screen slabs that would have come in between them, and then the moldings on top, right? So you can see the grooves that fit exactly with the width of the screen slabs. So all of this on top of each other would have come to about 1.5 meters, almost 2 meters in height. Now, so on top of, blocking off the side aisles completely so you can't see into the nave, what you're also getting is two what we call ambos, or sort of speakers platforms. And this is almost entirely unique. There are only 3, maybe 4 other examples where a church has 2 speakers platforms. One of these is at Amphipolis, right? A major site in the Eastern Roman Empire. So, strange for our little middle of nowhere rural Christian site to have that. The first one is right here in what we call the presbyterium. So this area is this is the area that would be marked off, right, where only the priests could come into, right, where the service would largely have been delivered from. Your apse is up here. The most sacred area of the whole site where the altar is, and then an ambo down here. Now these would have been elevated, right? So you go up a staircase to access these particular spaces. And part of the staircase, the decoration of the staircase we found, there was a high level of craftsmanship at our site. We had access to somebody, or the people who lived there had access to an excellent artist, someone who obviously is coming from abroad, whose closest parallels are actually in Syria for most of our art. And the other one is where you would expect it to be. So typically, you don't have an ambo in the presbyterium. Normally, you have them in the south side of the nave, right? The central part, the central aisle. And we found enough fragments to just give you an idea of how big this thing would have been. Decorated on all sides, right? The priest would have climbed the staircase. Well, actually, in this case, the bishop that we had at our church climbed the staircase, delivered part of his sermon right from the middle of the nave, or from the nave itself, and then again some of the more decorative elements from this particular ambo. So a lot of floral elements, doves. We have deer too, and a cantharos there. And actually, the closest parallel that we have comes from the Rotunda, right? The other church, one of the other churches outside. So the same artist seems to have been working on this site, on this basilica, and at the Rotunda Church. So we know that they were constructed at the same time. And then you can see the location of the 2 of them. So the large ambo out here, right where you would expect it to be, and this one inside of the presbyterium, which you would not expect. Now this is the weird one. This is where any input would be very welcome. I don't know what that is. We have a weird semicircular structure inside of our nave that makes no sense. There are no parallels for this thing anywhere in Christian church architecture. None. We've scoured everything. Every excavation site, every church that's been excavated, nothing. And what's weird about it is that it actually seems to predate our basilica. So it doesn't seem to be something that was purpose-built for us, for this church, this congregation, but something that they deliberately chose to incorporate into their site. Now, you've got a lower kind of wall that runs all the way around, and then blocks that are leaning up against it. And this lower wall has inserts for some kind of metal or wooden construction that maybe would have, held something up at a somewhat significant height. These ones are all sort of independent blocks that are cut up, and then that one up there is a long column. So already you're seeing material being reused for this particular structure that's cut into the floor, so that the floor basically was built around it. And we're finding 5th century material and structures over the last 2 years underneath the church, so maybe it had something to do with something that was built at that time, but whatever this is, we have no idea. So throw out suggestions. I'm very happy to hear them afterwards. Now, just to briefly discuss the apse, our apse is kind of unique and lovely in that it was a crypt. It was a martyria, which means that it held the relics of a martyr Which martyr, we don't know. What relics, no idea. But there is a crypt that you can access through where, so you would have had your altar here. You can go underneath the crypt, and there's an area actually underneath all of the apse that would have held the relics. But unfortunately, it was robbed out in Antiquity, so we don't know what kind of relics. But they would have been securely stored, maybe not so securely stored, underneath the apse. Now, briefly, because I'm going to run out of time soon, I want to talk to you about where I was excavating the last 2 years and perhaps the most beautiful, interesting part of the site to me. I mean, to be debated, I guess. But the exo-narthex and the food preparation in the storage room. So if you remember here, we have our major narthex, and then this room here seems to be some kind of waiting area for people who wanted to come and maybe arrived early, didn't want to go right into the church. Because there are benches all along the walls and access to the narthex and therefore access into the church itself. And this room seems to have been, one, reused, but two, built later. So while we're calling this an exo-narthex, as I've been working in this room for the last few years, in this area for the last few years, I think this is a later construction, that maybe what we're dealing with is what we call in Christian architecture an atrium, a large open space that you would sort of mill about in, and it would be the major sort of grand entrance into the basilica proper. So we're going to we're going to work around the walls, eventually probably tear these down, and see what we've got further out this way to see if we do in fact have that. And I say that because this wall, if you look at it compared to the other ones, it's so shoddily built. Most of our walls are nearly a meter thick. Here you've got 30 centimeters, maybe 50 centimeters. There's brick used. There's no mortar whatsoever. It's just mud. And none of these walls here actually bond with the walls of the church, right? They're built right up to the edge, but they don't bond with them. So they're not part of the original construction. And you can see here, too, there's an outline of a door, right? So even these rooms after the church went out of use were being closed, rebuilt, lived in. I mean, I think I pulled out 10 bags worth of pottery and bone just from this small area. So this was heavily occupied after the church went out of use. And that just kind of gives you a view from the other way. But I really want to focus on the food preparation room. And here, again, walls that aren't bonded with some of the walls all seems to be a bit later, suggesting that, again, our atrium is going out the other way. But this is where I spent the last summer working. And we're calling it the food preparation and storage room, one, because we have a massive pithos in the corner, and two, we actually have a fire pit, a clay-lined fire pit that we pulled, large, significant amount of charcoal out of. And you can still see evidence of some of the burning if you look at that other picture there. But what makes this room really unique and really special is, remember I said that only one place in the entire church we had paving? That's it. It's the only room in the entire basilica complex and the residence that has paved floors. It also was closed off by two beautiful screen slabs. That kind of decoration seems to have been purposely built for this room. It seems to be somewhat contemporaneous with the construction of the food storage room as a whole. But what we found in here was so different than anything we'd ever found in the entire site. So, one, these crevices here, we found massive amounts of glass. These beautiful vials that would have been used for oil. And we found pieces of a marble offering plate. The only marble to come from our site to date was this plate that came out of our room. And we found storage jars and smaller storage jars, metal, bronze, iron, more things than we pulled out in any of the other rooms combined from this small room. So what we think is that we've actually found the room where the Eucharist, right, the bread and the wine would have been prepared, and that this would have been a sort of offering room, for lack of a better term. Normally, you don't see these two things in the same space. Normally, something like this is located immediately next to the altar, right? That makes sense. Where you would receive the Eucharist, not where the Eucharist is being prepared. So we're going to explore this a little bit further next year and see what we can figure out from that. But it's entirely unique to anything that we've seen so far at our site. Now, I just want to conclude by talking a little bit about how the site went out of use. So as you can see, there was a massive destruction at our site. This is the south aisle of our basilica. There was evidence for a fire sometime in the 6th century. So down here you can see a little bit the remains of the fire. And then the entire roof seems to have collapsed in on the basilica. And after the roof collapsed, people went back and lived and squatted. So right on top of our collapse area is where we found all that squatter occupation until the 7th century. But mixed in with that squatter occupation, we kept finding evidence for significant, let's say, attacks on the people who were living there. So we found these ballista balls that you would have, catapulted or thrown at people that are strewn all over the site. So whoever was remaining down here, they were obviously under attack, and then they all, again, fled up to the top of the Acropolis. And unfortunately, this site stood to an even greater height. We have records of the site being almost to its full height of the wall, the wall minus the roof, up until the 20th century. If you want to know where that material went, look no further than the village of Konjuh, where our workmen currently live amongst all the bricks from the upper courses. So if you want to know what the bricks look like, just go to the village, and they'll show you their fire ovens or basically their houses made out of the bricks from our basilica. And just sort of a few sort of final concluding remarks. This is a really relatively large site for late antiquity. I mean, the whole thing is 17 hectares in size. It had at least 4 churches. The Rotunda, the cemetery basilica, this one, a smaller one just outside of the walls. And our evidence indicates that it was the seat of the bishop. 1, the large complex. 2, the fact that there was a baptistry. And that this bishop was fairly well learned, obviously very wealthy if he could construct something like this. And that he was probably responsible for the construction of at least the Rotunda, if not several of the other churches. And unfortunately, our church didn't exist for very long. It's kind of rare to have a 2-period occupation site in Macedonia, where history goes back so much further than that. But the basilica went out of use sometime in the mid-6th century. Squatter occupation throughout the 7th, and the site totally abandoned after that. But fortunately, we'll never know what the site is until we find an inscription. No one's writing about this wonderful little slice of heaven in the ancient records. So until we find an inscription, this will remain a very large but beautiful anonymous city just off of the Kriva River. Thank you.
There's time for questions. I just also wanted to note that following this, there's a reception over at Clubilia. We reserved the back room, and there'll be some appies there. If you get there before 5, they have happy hour drink specials. For $3, or you can purchase as many as you want for $3. So, are there questions for Sabrina? Yes. What's that?
You put the lights on.
Oh, yes.
I was just thinking, when you talked about that small room inside the food preparation area, and you're saying it was the only paved area. Is there evidence that maybe other areas were paved and robbed out early, and this was kind of sealed off, and that's why you've got these materials and these floors, and it looks different?
None.
No.
No. So normally, if you have paving, you would expect to find depressions at least, or remnants of stone, something. There's nothing. It's totally flat. It's fairly even, which is shocking, actually, for having mortar floors, and no mosaics, no plaster, nothing. We have scoured and sieved, but nothing. So, but that's also not uncommon. What is uncommon is to find a single paved room in an area that's totally unpaved.
And the artifact preservation, would that suggest that it wasn't looted to the same extent, or?
Yeah, it would, which is also kind of shocking, given that it seems to be one of the more important areas within the church, aside from the apse, of course. But it seems to have been entirely missed by robbers. So part of what I have to deal with every year is, and I don't think you can really see it on this plan, but every year I have to dig through robber pits. Pits in everything that I've dug. And so you have to clear those areas first before you can get to uncontaminated material. And it didn't even come close to that one. So I think it was just by luck that we got this. I mean, there's nothing so substantial in there that would be worth robbing, to be honest. But compared to what else we're finding, I mean, it's a big, beautiful, well-built, obviously rich bishop in a very poor town. So, as far as we can tell.
I'm not sure if I missed that, but you were saying about the different rocks that were used in the baptistry.
Mm-hmm.
You
Yes.
give us a conclusion about where those came from? They are different there?
We don't know. We do know that there is a Roman fort somewhere in the area, largely because we've got a relief stele that I published, which is a Thracian rider. So obviously not part of this Christian community, and we see spolia, other things like this, where this is a purpose-built Christian community, spolia being built in the walls, particularly from the northern residents, that seems to have been taken from a Roman settlement elsewhere. But we don't know where it is. So I guess that it would come from the same place, because there are no, I mean, there was a green stone and then a purplish color stone, which there's nothing that you can quarry in the area. So it was obviously taken from somewhere else.
Is there a possibility this is a monastic zone? I dug at San Vincenzo and was done over a couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
It's strikingly similar. I mean, I was quite a lot later at the time.
Absolutely.
It's strikingly similar.
Yeah, no, I mean, the problem with what we've dug so far is that we focused almost entirely on the Basilica. So as soon as they found the Basilica, excavations elsewhere were abandoned at the site. So while we may have excavated a few houses, we don't know the date of those houses. But I suspect that the church, or at least a smaller church, was built there first, because there are structures underneath the Basilica, for sure. We haven't dug those yet. So the directors decided to dig sort of settlement by settlement. So once everything's exposed, I think then we'll dig under the floors of the Basilica. We started to a little bit this year. So I think that it was a monastic settlement. I mean, it makes sense. I think it was. But we won't know until we can excavate some of the houses and see sort of the relationship of the dates between the two. But given the location of the Basilica itself, it's kind of central within the terrace, I would think that it would be.
Now, in San Vincenzo has a lot of the buildings that they're very strong, similar to the
Yeah.
corridor, and the settlement part is a lot different. But it is really, I mean, it might be worth looking at those plans.
Yeah, I mean, if it isn't a monastic settlement, I mean, it could just be a very sort of ambitious, bishop building in a town. I mean, there is a town underneath here. We've done geophys. So whether or not it was a monastic settlement first, and this is why it's so out of the way, and why this church is constantly being rebuilt in all of these larger sort of areas, it makes sense. But yeah, we won't know until we can see the relationship of it all and sort of open it up a little bit more. I don't think Carolyn, the director, believes it's a monastic settlement. I think she thinks it's a bishop's palace and a large church. I'm more open to the idea.
Well, presumably there's a correlation. If it's a community church, there's a correlation between the size of the community and the size of the church. And that's one great big church.
It is, yeah.
With no obvious great big community.
Yeah, so far.
Question and then question.
Okay.
Okay. I assume this has been thought of, but you're asking for thorough
Yes,
ideas.
please.
The small area inside the basilica, not possibly just an older shrine that they decided to build the basilica on top of?
It could very well be. What we're seeing is we've got an apse kind of going this way from the minor excavations we've done under the floor level. And we haven't explored how far that extends that way yet. But the fact that we have an apse here, one, it's not facing east, which it would have to face east, makes me think that maybe it's a small side room or a side chapel. And if that was included inside of it, it seems kind of off place to me. I don't know, but it's very possible. Yeah.
Well, I have two thoughts. One, you haven't finished excavating the area which is to the south?
Yeah, to the north.
To the north?
Yeah.
Is that not either the bishop's palace or the monastery that is connected to this big basilica?
Yes, we haven't seen.
You've got a colonnaded corridor in there, which is kind of reminiscent of a cloister.
Absolutely, yeah. We haven't seen any direct connection between the basilica and the residence yet. So we've excavated all of this area, and there isn't a single doorway leading from one to the other yet. So until we get over here, I think we'll have a better idea. If it is connected, I would think it would be.
And that's secured within the nave, right? Mm-hmm. And is it possible that it could have been something that you're seeing the base of something that is raised up, like an area where important people would have been seated versus and separated from the regulars?
It's a possible.
Kind of like they have in Hagia Sophia.
Yeah, it's possible. My only sort of hesitation with that is it is not well constructed at all. While the lower area that has the cuts into it is well built and sort of stuck into the ground.
But if it was carved wood or something, you wouldn't necessarily have to.
True. Yeah, that's very true. I don't know. I think that's probably the best suggestion we've had so far. But the leaning of these pieces here, these stones, they're
displaced slightly.
no, they're never been dug into the ground. So we've explored underneath it, and they're just kind of leaning against them. So I don't know what that aspect of it is. But that is certainly the best idea we've had so far. So I will bring that up with Carolyn because I think that's great. I do, yeah, I do.
In Hagia Sophia.
Yeah.
But theirs is quite raised up, and clearly it's more. But
Yeah.
you could have a similar thing.
Could.
Out of wood.
And I mean, this person is obviously not from the area. This church is nothing like any of the other basilicas that you're seeing in Macedonia. And it does have a lot more.
It was never reused as a mosque.
No, it went out of use in the 7th century. I think because it was in an area that was constantly being invaded. So nothing would have lasted there at that point. But yeah, that's really intriguing, Dimitri.
You mentioned 3 different columns.
Yeah.
For the baptistry alone?
For the baptistry. We've had all of them. There are 8. 6 of them are white. There's one that's green and one that's, I hate to use the word purple because it's not really purple, but it's like a purpley pink.
And is this kind of multicolored in the column from around the nave or another area of the church? Or is this
No, it's unique to that baptistry. They just kind of appear, and we don't see them anywhere else yet in the site.
And I know almost nothing about archaeology or art history, but this kind of multicolored sort of theme is what Acropolis in many ways uses in his description of Hagia Sophia. as kind of being a meadow of different flowers created out of this variation of
Yes.
materials. Do we see it in general, or could we, on the basis of, let's say, what Procopius does see influences from Constantinopolitan kind of sort of fads?
There are certainly fads from the east. So this bishop, or whoever is building this, is obviously coming from the east. Our current thought is maybe even Syria. There's a lot of Syrian elements that I just didn't have time to get into. But certainly spent time in Constantinople and in in Greek Macedonia. So there are influences coming from all over the place here, and I wouldn't be surprised if he was, astutely familiar with Procopius and trying to incorporate that as much as possible. We see plaster from some of the walls that it's very colorful, but not a lot of it survives.
The multicolored columns wouldn't have just come from, as you say, there is some sort of Roman structure in a way, and early Christian art just tended to take the stuff out of pagan places and use them.
Exactly. And in one of the walls that I found, there's so many interesting things about the site. In here, the walls was partially rebuilt using a statue bust, or like a torso. So, they're taking all kinds of things from this Roman settlement and using them sort of all over the place. I just wish we could find it so we could connect the two in the next 20 years.
Final question, Dr. Collar. Just want to ask the skeletons was
Yeah.
how many?
6.
6. Okay.
All of them secondary burials.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.